And now, without further delay, I want to introduce our speaker today, Gwen Etter-Lewis, a person with a PhD in English and linguistics. She's director of the linguistics program at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Now I've got the right city. And she's the founder and director of Dream Keepers, a college readiness program for underserved high school students in the greater Cincinnati area. Dr. Etter-Lewis also serves on the local spiritual assembly of West Chester Township in Ohio. She's a faculty member for the Wilmette Institute, where she co-teaches a course on anti-Black racism in the U.S., the most vital and challenging issue. And we are very grateful to Gwen for writing us and emailing us and saying you have to do something on race unity. And so we really can trace this course back to her persistent efforts to make sure that we figured out how to do it and to do it right. She's also published quite a few books and articles, including one called Lights of the Spirit, Historical Portraits of Black Baha'is in North America, 1898 to 2000, with Richard Thomas, whom many of you have probably heard of as well. So without further ado, I want to welcome Gwen. Thank you so much, Gwen, today for joining us, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your presentation.
So I want to begin by thanking Rob for that kind introduction. And I also want to thank the Wilmette Institute for listening, for being willing to create that course on anti-Black racism, a Baha'i perspective. I also thank the Wilmette Institute for the invitation to be with you today. I give praise to God for granting us the opportunity to come together in this meeting. And I am grateful to our ancestors who made it possible for us to live and be present in this momentous day and time. The title of my presentation is African American Women in the Baha'i Faith, Intersectionality, Myths, and Restorative History. I altered the title to reflect more accurately a larger context for us to consider the lives and contributions of African American Baha'i women. I have organized my presentation into 4 overarching themes, with African American women Baha'is woven in between. Those themes are witnessing and testifying, the myth of exceptional women, intersectionality, and restorative history. I begin with this quote because it reminds me so much of the early African American believers who arose to serve the faith with perseverance and fortitude. The light of their courageous deeds still shines if we but take the time to remember. I beg of thee, O King of existence, and protector of the seen and unseen, to make whosoever ariseth to serve thy cause, as a sea moving by thy desire, as one ablaze with the fire of thy sacred tree, shining from the horizon of the heaven of thy will. When I think about African American women's lives in the past and in the present, what comes to mind is the customary practice of witnessing and testifying. That is, to bear witness means to express that something exists or is true. To testify means to give voice to that truth. From our African roots to the present day, Black women have testified in so many different ways. One of the ways that we bear witness and testify is by sharing the stories of our lives and those of our loved ones. Andrea Collier writes, while story means so much in every culture and ethnicity, I know that Black folk, no matter how they got here, are planted in story. and shared lived experience. It's the way we witness. As Congressman John Lewis says, the movement without storytelling is like birds without wings. And this from Kimberle Crenshaw, the author of several studies and books, but she is an attorney and a scholar who is given credit for coining the term intersectionality that I will talk about later. We must begin to tell Black women's stories because without them, we cannot tell the story of Black men, white women, or anyone else in this country. The story of Black women is critical because those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. So here are some early Black women's testimonies. These are testimonies, if you will, witnessing in the forms of narratives and books written by African American women who lived in the early 19th century. So Hallie Quinn Brown published this book, Homespun Heroines and Other Women of Distinction, in 1926. This was a collection of biographies of African American women who were born in the US or Canada between 1740 and the turn of the century. Annie L. Burton's narrative was published in 1909, and this was the result of a school project. She, after being freed from being enslaved, sought to gain more education, and as a result, she wound up in the Franklin Evening School, where the instructor gave an assignment asking students to write their life stories, and this was Annie Burton's project. Another one is Harriet E. Wilson's Our Nig, Sketches from the Life of a Free Black. This narrative was published anonymously in 1859 and thought to be the work of a white author. But thanks to the work of scholar Henry Louis Gates Jr., it was discovered that Harriet Wilson was indeed an African American woman and was the first African American to publish a novel in the US. Henry Gates republished the novel in 1983. And finally, Behind the Scenes, 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House by Elizabeth Keckley, is an account of her life and her experiences as being the dressmaker and the confidant of Mary Todd Lincoln, both during the years when the president was alive and afterwards. So these women were not Baha'is, but their text formed a foundation for the Black Baha'i women who were yet to come. Before I share with you some of the narratives of African American Baha'i women, I want to remind you of this very powerful metaphor by Baha'u'llah. This helps us more fully understand the significance of Black people's participation in the faith. Baha'u'llah once compared the colored people to the black pupil of the eye surrounded by the white. In this black pupil, you see the reflection of that which is before it, and through it, the light of the Spirit shines forth. This metaphor suggests that within the faith, Baha'u'llah has elevated the role of people of African descent and removes from them the stigma of an unjustly tarnished character. Add to the pupil of the eye metaphor the principle of the Baha'i principle of the equality of women and men. Abdu'l-Baha writes, and among the teachings of Baha'u'llah is the equality of women and men. The world of humanity has two wings. One is women and the other men. Not until both wings are equally developed can the bird fly. And sometimes we have to ask, what does this look like in the future? How will this impact humanity? And here's a glimpse. Again, it is well established in history that where woman has not participated in the human affairs, the outcomes have never attained a state of completion and perfection. On the other hand, every influential undertaking of the human world wherein woman has been a participant has attained importance. Black women standing at the crossroads of both the pupil of the eye and the equality of men and women, they embody one of the most revolutionary and transformative concepts of the Baha'i faith. They are both pupil of the eye, and they are both women who are equal to men. So when I look for testimonies of African American women Baha'is, I turn right away to Coralie Franklin Cook and Sadie Oglesby. Coralie became a Baha'i along with her husband in 1910. She and her husband were professors at Howard University. In 1914, she penned a letter to Abdul Baha, a very lengthy, a very beautifully written letter where she talks about the race issues in the US. She writes, by some strange phenomena, certain white people think or affect to think that if a colored person shares in the ordinary privileges which pertain to comfort and convenience, or political or civic right, that it means social equality. To any but a morbid mind or diseased mind, this seems like unbelievable absurdity, which is making the position of colored people almost unbearable and robbing American white people of any rightful claims to an exalted position, because they are either participants in or silent witnesses of the gross injustice. When we turn to Sadie Oglesby, we also find a similar witnessing, but from a slightly different perspective. Sadie and her husband Mabry became Baha'is in 1914. Sadie and her daughter Bertha became the first African American women to go on pilgrimage to the Baha'i holy places in 1927. Sadie was a homemaker, and her husband Mabry owned a real estate business. When Sadie went on pilgrimage, she met with Shoghi Effendi, and she made notes of her experiences there. And these are some of the things that she said. She wrote, Shoghi Effendi said, when I returned to America, I should seek no rest, but be constant and urgent. The importance of this matter should be understood by the friends, that I should be fearless and compelling. I expressed my great sorrow to him and told him I was quite unprepared, unqualified for the work he wished me to do. I said to him, I have no strength or importance in America. I am so sorry. To this, Shoghi Effendi said, when you return to America, do as I have told you. Be fearless and know that the invisible concourse will assist you, and I will supplicate at the holy shrine on your behalf. Later, she also reflects on this experience and says, we are not the same people as we were before we went away on pilgrimage. So I know what my work is now, as I have never known it before. And after that, we see Sadie's return to the US as she is being obedient. If you look at the minutes from various meetings, if you look at the convention reports, you will find Sadie Oglesby on the floor of these meetings, urging her fellow Baha'is to be active in implementing and facilitating the unity of mankind. Every Baha'i most Baha'is were talking about this. Louis Gregory wrote and talked about how wonderful it was and how much Sadie Oglesby influenced all Baha'is to be more active in this endeavor. It is also important to understand that writing or speaking, those are only two ways that we can testify, that we can bear witness. There are other ways. For example, Creadell Haley testified through song. She was a Baha'i who was a licensed pilot, and she had two loves: auto mechanics and aviation, and music. She studied music in Ohio as well as in California. Some of her songs appeared on the Baha'i album Fire and Snow, and I would like to just play for you very briefly a part of one of her songs that appeared on this album where she is singing.
Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah. The Lord of hosts, the Lord of hosts, the Lord of hosts. Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah. The Spirit of truth, the Spirit of truth, the Spirit of truth. Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah. The promised one of all the ages, the promised one of all the ages. Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah.
In a very beautiful and clear voice, Creadell Haley sung the praises of Baha'u'llah. The other person that I'd like to share with you is Harriet Gibbs Marshall. She became a Baha'i in 1912 and was also very interested in music. She became the first African-American woman to graduate from the Oberlin Conservatory of Music in 1899. In 1903, she established the Washington Conservatory of Music for African American students interested in the conservatory approach. She taught the faith in Haiti and had many exchanges with Louis Gregory about experiences and teaching in that part of the world. She also offered up her school building to Baha'is in the area, in the Washington, D.C. area, to hold meetings. This was one of the few places where Baha'is could hold integrated meetings at that time. The last person in this section that I would like to talk about is Zilpha Johnson Mapp Gray. She is often confused with her daughter, Dr. Zilpha Mapp Robinson, who is also an amazing woman. But for today, I would like to focus on the mother, Zilpha Johnson Mapp Gray. She became a Baha'i in 1916 and served on the Boston Spiritual Assembly from about 1928 to 1934. In the family history, there's an account of one very bad winter when Zilpha had to travel from her home to the place where the local spiritual assembly was holding its meetings. She had to travel by train, and the distance from her home to the train station was about 3/4 of a mile. And Zilpha said to her family that night when she returned home from the assembly meeting that she had to walk through waist-high snow to get back home, traveling by foot 3/4 of a mile. And she said the only way that she achieved that is that she said the greatest name with every step. She became the president of the Springfield Women's Club in 1960. And this photo here is a photo of the Springfield, Massachusetts Women's Club, although Zilpha is not pictured here. One of the things that I wanted to share with you about her membership in this club is that they had a service project one year and that lasted about 4 years. And this service project was to provide materials and goods to Native American children at the White Earth Mission reservation. So, using her skills as a seamstress, Zilpha designed, cut, and sewed 50 to 60 dresses for these Native American children. She did this 50 to 60 dresses every year for 4 years, designed, cut, and sewn by herself. So these are just some examples of ways that you can testify or witness without writing or speaking your life. You could sing it. You can also do it, perform it. And Zilpha also wrote poetry. And if we had had more time, I would share with you some of her poetry. The next theme that I want to talk about is the myth of the exceptional woman. In order to contextualize the meaning of this myth, I thought it would be a good idea to revisit the dictionary definition of the word. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, exceptional has at least 3 meanings: rare, superior, deviating from the norm. When we look at synonyms, we find such words as aberrant, aberrated, abnormal, anomalous, atypical, especial, exceeding, extraordinary, freak, odd, peculiar, phenomenal, preternatural, rare, singular, uncommon, uncustomary, unique, unusual, unwanted. So when you look at this group of words, these synonyms, you see that some are very positive and some are negative. So my question is, when we think about women in general and Black women in particular, how many of these synonyms apply? Another way to look at the exceptional woman is to take a look at cartoonist Jackie Fleming's book, The Trouble with Women, published in 2016. Jackie talks about this book project and says that in the beginning, Her purpose was to write a book about exceptional women who had been overlooked by history. However, the more she researched, the more she discovered that there were more women than she could name. She had at least filled 11 notebooks with women's names and biographies and still hadn't made a dent. So instead of doing this, she decided to write the book about the ways that biased perceptions of women limited acknowledgement of their capacity and their achievements. So at the top of the screen, you have one of the ideas that early on was generated in terms of what the public thought about women, but especially men. Early women did not need an education as they were feeble-minded. Female brains were not only smaller, but they were made of soft, spongy, lightweight material. So these and other hilarious and sad and ignorant ideas are in this book, but it gives us an indication of how women were thought about through no fault of their own. So I've also included some information from Sherry Tucker and Tammy Knodel, who separately wrote about the history of women in jazz, and they talked about the exceptional woman in their work. Women are invisible because they weren't good enough. Playing good enough meant playing like men. Women who play like men are exceptional women, and exceptional women can enter the discourse without changing it. And Sherry goes on to talk about the importance of not changing the discourse when you enter it. This also from Dr. Tammy Knodel. She said, one is left to believe that exceptional women work primarily in isolation from each other, because while the stage can accommodate as many exceptional men as possible, there is space for only one exceptional woman. So to explain this further, I have one more example of the exceptional woman myth that I want to share with you. And that is the situation with Rosa Parks. Before Rosa Parks, there were other women who refused to give up their seats on the bus. There was Aurelia Browder, Viola White, Geneva Johnson, Katie Wingfield, Susie McDonald, Epsie Worthy, Mary Louise Smith Ware, and Claudette Colvin, all before Rosa Parks. And Colvin, in fact, was 15 at the time she refused to give up her seat. She was taken off the bus, beaten, and arrested for disturbing the peace. When we turn to African American Baha'i women, we find a similar pattern. After Olive Jackson, who was the first African American woman to become a Baha'i in 1899, there were these women. And this is only a partial list, but my point here is that there were other women in these early days who embraced the Baha'i faith. My point here is that questioning the exceptional woman myth by no means is meant to diminish the significance of those women who were first, those women who were the first to break barriers, to step across that tightly guarded threshold into a man's world. This questioning of the exceptional woman myth is intended for us to acknowledge and to realize that there were always more than one. The next theme is that of intersectionality. Very simply, it is a web of interconnected relationships between multiple forms of oppression. Kimberle Crenshaw, attorney and scholar, was credited with coining this term. She explains it this way. It's basically a lens, a prism, for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
Now, there is another less acknowledged side of intersectionality, and that is intersectional invisibility. It can be described this way. Intersectional invisibility provides a framework for understanding how Black women who live at the intersection of racism and sexism may be harmed when their unique experiences as Black women are not recognized. So, to illustrate this idea, I draw on examples of African American Baha'i women who may seem to be invisible in some way because of their unique circumstances. So the first person I want to talk about is Lucille Webster, who earlier this year celebrated her 99th birthday. I had the bounty of meeting Lucille and interviewing her and taking her oral history. She became a Baha'i in 1946 in Cleveland, Ohio. She was a Foreign Service officer, and how she got to that point is interesting in and of itself. And so I want to talk about how she became a Baha'i before I talk about how she got to Tokyo. When she entered college in 1946, she rented a room from Mrs. Mabel Perry, a Baha'i in Cleveland, Ohio. Lucille noticed that Mrs. Perry, she knew Mrs. Perry was a Baha'i, but she didn't know anything about the Baha'i faith. She did notice, however, Mrs. Perry, as an African American woman, was acting not what Lucille would say norm. And I am paraphrasing, of course, her story as she told it to me. She said that she noticed that Mrs. Perry 2 to 3 times a week would have tea in her garden with her Baha'i friends. And some of these friends, among these friends, were 1 or 2 white women, which Lucille thought was a bit unusual. She also saw this photo on Mrs. Perry's bookshelf of this old man with a flowing white beard and a turban. And she asked Mrs. Perry what his name was. And Mrs. Perry said, "Oh, I will tell you later." She then asked if he was a member of the family. And Mrs. Perry said, "Well, I would like to think so." Of course, this was a photo of Abdul Baha. So, as time went on, Lucille asked Mrs. Perry for something to read about this strange faith. And Mrs. Perry said, "Oh, I don't think you would be interested." So, Lucille at night, after everyone went to bed, would sneak down into the parlor, take Baha'i books out, read them, and put them back before everyone woke up the next morning. So Mrs. Perry, sensing Lucille's interest in the faith, invited her to breakfast and said to her, "I have something to tell you. And after I tell you this, my responsibility is done. The rest is yours." And so she said, we are Baha'is, and we believe that Jesus Christ has returned. And Lucille said, "Oh no, that's not true. I don't believe it. If that had happened, it would have been on the television, all over the news, and so on and so forth." So they had this conversation going back and forth with one another. And finally, Mrs. Perry said, "Why don't you come to some of the firesides we're having in the Cleveland area and accompany me to summer school this summer?" And that's exactly what happened. Lucille accompanied Mrs. Perry to summer school, and at the end of summer school, Lucille was ready to become a Baha'i. But she said the local spiritual assembly asked her to study more before she actually officially became a Baha'i. So Lucille said, "I read these books. The Promised Day has come, God Passes By, The Advent of Divine Justice, and the Will and Testament." And after that, she met with the local spiritual assembly who questioned her on her knowledge of these texts, and she became a Baha'i. When The Guardian called for Baha'is to spread the word of the faith to Africa in 1952, Lucille and some of her fellow Baha'is wanted to fulfill this goal. So Lucille applied for the U.S. Foreign Service, and she said that she and 3 of her Baha'is friends met for 9 weeks and prayed the Tablet of Ahmad each 9 times when they met in order to receive guidance on how to fulfill this goal of spreading the faith to Africa. So Lucille applied to the U.S. Foreign Service, was finally accepted, and she said they didn't realize I was Black until I showed up. And then I had to wait for 6 months for an appointment. So she was sent to Tokyo in 1955, and from there she asked for a hardship placement, which sent her to Seoul, Korea. And here in this photo, you see that she helped form the first spiritual assembly, local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Seoul, Korea in 1956. And this is Lucille, as you see in the front on the ground, looking very serious. After her service in Korea, she served in Mexico City, Bolivia, Norway, and Paris. And in Norway, she was the only African American Baha'i. Another person I want to share with you is Valerie Wilson, who pioneered to Liberia in 1952. She helped form the first Baha'i assembly in Liberia. And this is, and as you can see, this is Valerie sitting beside of William Foster she looks like she has on a corsage, and she has a dress that has black piping around the collar and the sleeves. I have so much more to tell you, but I am running out of time, so I am going to move on. One final person that I wanted to talk to you about is Lucille Giscombe, a Canadian Baha'i who, along with Winifred Harvey, were the first Baha'is in Ottawa, Canada. Winifred became a Baha'i in 1940 and taught the faith to Lucille, who became a Baha'i in about 1941 or 1942, somewhere around then. She was a journalist, but she found that she could not find work in Canada as a journalist. So in 1948, at the age of 36, she traveled to England and then to Czechoslovakia, where she settled. She became fluent in Czech and became the editor of a Prague newspaper. She stayed there until she became ill and wanted to return to her home Canada, but was prevented from re-entering the country because of a legal technicality. So unfortunately, Lucille passed in Czechoslovakia. I bring up her situation because not much is known about her life in Czechoslovakia. And I also look to her as an example of how some African American women, their history, their lives, and their contributions fall through the cracks. I want to briefly, in the few minutes that I have left, and how time goes fast, I want to talk about the fourth and last theme, and that is restorative history. It was a term coined by activist M. Campbell Yon. As far as I can determine, academics have not endorsed this term, but I think it offers a unique and insightful approach to history. Similar to restorative justice, restorative history pays attention to repairing harm or damage and ultimate transformation. Jan writes this: as a result, too many of these re-centralized bodies of knowledge, Black history, Black history, women's history, multicultural studies, etc., have become ghettoized. They are still not considered the history, but rather subsidiary histories to the primary history of the colonizer. In schools, they are elective instead of required courses. In reality, they have been pushed back to the margins. So in developing restorative history, I am attempting to confront and completely dismantle the frameworks that have made the colonizer's history the primary history. So according to Jan, there are at least three processes for restorative history: decolonize, decenter, restore. The decolonization process involves eliminating the overwhelming influence of the dominant culture, methods, and values. The process of decentering means removing from the primary place of importance the dominant culture. And the third process, restore, focuses on repairing damage such as misinformation and other incorrect information, and at the same time instituting multiple and diverse voices within the whole. What does decolonizing history look like? Here are some thoughts. Attorney H. Elsie Austin writes, in some future age, when history is no longer written to advance the prestige and power of particular groups and nations, perhaps historians will be able to state frankly how much of the tragedy and chaos of our world has been due to the efforts of men and women who distorted civilization and humanity by deliberately provoking animosity and division over the outward differences of men. And this from Sue Lynn Lewis, a historian. The process of decolonizing history is broadly about making historians aware of and committed to addressing the disproportionate focus on Eurocentric history in the profession and attuned to the struggles of power underlying this. The study of decolonization rests on an understanding of imperial power and its implication in struggles of racial discrimination, as well as the fraught processes of disentangling colonized societies from the economic, political, social, cultural, and psychological damage of imperial rule. This is no easy task. After all, we are talking about overcoming biased intellectual traditions that have infiltrated all aspects of our lives. Therefore, I think there is one step that is a prerequisite for decolonizing history, and that is decolonizing knowledge. In a letter written on behalf of the Universal House of Justice in 1983, there are many aspects of Western thinking which have been exalted to a status of unassailable principle in the general mind. That time may well show to have been erroneous, or at least only partially true. And this from Margaret Kovac. While colonization came to affect every aspect of indigenous life, Western science in particular has worked to first subjugate and then discredit indigenous knowledge systems and the peoples themselves. Ultimately, it is about what kinds of knowledge are valued and who gets to judge. But it is not just history. Scholars in literature, women's studies, art, and other fields have demanded an end to colonization, to Western ways of doing things, intellectual or otherwise. And not surprisingly, some of the most insightful approaches we find in the work of Indigenous scholars, as well as in the work of scholars of color. In the last few minutes I have, I want to share the last two examples of women that I find fall into this category of being overlooked in some ways, as well as also being part and women whose stories we would know if we could decenter knowledge. I use these two profiles to illustrate the way traditional knowledge and history privileges a few while overlooking others. Just as some popular accounts of the women's suffrage movement in the US ignored Black women, some reports of the civil rights movement also overlooked Black women. For example, in the 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech, there was no Black woman speaker featured on that program. So, two brief stories from these two African American Baha'is. Irma Hayden and Marion Townsend Jackson. Irma Hayden is pictured here with Mag Carney, one of my spiritual mothers, and both of these women were dynamic, amazing Baha'is. Irma became a Baha'i in 1942, and her husband, poet Robert Hayden, became a Baha'i in 1943. Irma shared with me when I collected her oral history. I knew her when I was an undergraduate at Fisk University in Nashville, and I also knew her later when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and that's where I collected her oral history. Anyway, she shared the story with me of traveling to the South, throughout the South, to give talks on the Baha'i faith. And since we are limited in time, I cannot tell you the whole story, but I will paraphrase it as best I can. She said that she had to change buses in Alabama, and that she was always a little wary of Alabama. But the Interstate Commerce Commission had just issued a ruling that Black travelers could wait in white waiting rooms if they were traveling interstate. And Irma did this when she arrived in Alabama. She waited in the white waiting room. But to make a long story short, two white men came over, picked her up, picked her luggage up, and threw her out of the waiting room. There's more to the story than this, but Irma said, whenever there's a law on the books, I feel that we must practice it. We must obey it. Otherwise, it will fade into oblivion. And the last story I'd like to share with you is that of Marion Townsend King Jackson, a civil rights activist who, along with her husband Slater King, fought for civil rights in Georgia. Just a few weeks ago, there was a program honoring her on March 26, 2021, organized by Jamila Kennedy and others in the Atlanta area. We learned once again to appreciate Marion Townsend King Jackson. And part of what I want to share with you is the story of when she had to travel from her home to another town to bring some clothes and food to some of the civil rights protesters who had been arrested and jailed. At this time, she had 2 or 3 of her children with her, and she was also 6 to 7 months pregnant. When she arrived at the jail, she ran into resistance from the policeman, who ultimately assaulted her and caused her to lose her baby. The thing that stuck out in my mind about this is that Marion forgave these men who committed this grievous crime. And her son, Dr. Jonathan King, in a television interview, who was 3, who was there with with his mother when this incident happened, said that is one of the most important things that he learned from his mother. That is forgiveness. Abdu'l-Baha writes, "The woman is indeed the greater importance to the race. She has the greater burden and the greater work. Look at the vegetable and the animal worlds. The palm which carries the fruit is the tree most prized by the date grower. The woman has greater moral courage than the man. She has also special gifts which enable her to govern in moments of danger and crisis. If necessary, she can become a warrior." I close with a few last thoughts. Baha'u'llah writes, "Knowledge is as the wings to man's life and a ladder for his ascent. Its acquisition is incumbent upon everyone." knowledge of our ancestors, their words and deeds, inspire us, console us, enlightens us. To that end, I share with you a few lines from this poem by Nikita Oliver. Say her name. My sister, we remember you, seeing how they gather the trails of your stardust. I want us to say your name and remember. Knowledge is not enough. We hope by the love of God, we shall put it into practice, to know that it is possible to reach a state of perfection is good. To march forward on the path is better. And finally, for all of us, to take the knowledge we acquire, how do we apply this to our own life? How do we learn from our ancestors? And how do we use this knowledge to help others and to establish the unity of mankind? The Universal House of Justice reminds us a moment of historic portent has arrived for your nation as the conscience of its citizenry has stirred, creating possibilities for marked social change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gwen, for an absolutely incredible, I agree, Janae's awesome presentation. Really, really very moving, both in a warmth and spiritual sense and in a very deep intellectual sense as well. The way you organized it, the points that you made, I think, will stick with us for quite a long time. And we have various comments, of course, already, and questions that are coming in, and a lot of thank yous as well have been coming in on the chat. Let's see if I can get over here. Absolutely wonderful, educational, and beautiful. Awesome presentation. A lovely gift, outstanding presentation. So lots of really very positive comments in the chat. I don't see any questions just yet, but I was very moved by the story about the woman who goes to the Czech Republic. I can't imagine how you can learn a foreign language well enough to edit in it. And you have to be pretty desperate to do that when you can't edit in your own language. I mean,
well,
the sadness of that.
But you have to be pretty smart to be able to do that.
Absolutely.
She was 38 when she moved to the Czech Republic. And, you know, linguistically speaking, that's after the critical period for learning language, so that she learned it well enough to become fluent and edit a newspaper. It was truly amazing.
Yeah, that really is an incredible act of really resilience.
Yes.
And of resistance to a form of oppression.
Yes.
That's really an amazing story. And thank you again for the stories about Zilpha, and it's nice to see some of the other individuals there. The Mag Carney's picture warms my heart. She was such an amazing lady. She reportedly had an absolutely enormous correspondence that she was carrying out with people, all of course before the era of the internet. So she was writing letters to people, I understand. And I was the beneficiary of a spaghetti dinner with her once in Haifa. And some of the comments she made on that occasion have really stuck with me since as well.
You know, that was one of the most wonderful things that I remember about Meg is her correspondence. I have a file folder of letters from Meg because when she went to serve at the World Center in the Holy Land, we were all sad to see her go, but she maintained her contact with us. So and in the small town where I became a Baha'i, she wrote letters to me. She wrote letters to my mom. She wrote letters to my family. It was just truly amazing in the most beautiful handwriting. And she said the most profound things in her letters. So I am deeply appreciative of that.
Yeah. Fran Otto says that she's doing research on Edith Chapman, one of the first African-American Baha'i women in Kansas City. And so that's marvelous to hear about. And she took one of our courses actually on writing histories and biographies, if I recall. And I hope that project can move forward as well.
I look forward to that because I could only find just bits and pieces of information about Edith Chapman, some letters that had been only 1 or 2 pages or something torn out. So I'm happy to hear that there's work on Edith Chapman going on.
Good. And you and I had previously been talking about Dorothy Champ.
Yes.
And when you gave the quote on Wings of One Bird, I pulled out my copy of Selections from the Writings of Abdu'l-Baha to look the quote up because I wanted the exact words. And what do you think falls out of my selections from the writings of Abdu'l-Baha?
Dorothy Champ.
The newspaper obituary of Dorothy Champ. Mm-hmm. It was in my copy of Selections from the Writings of Abdu'l-Baha, so I will be sure to photograph that and send that off to you.
I would appreciate it. It's like she's looking down upon us now saying, here's some more information.
Yeah, exactly. Really quite nice to see. She was 86, it says here, when she died, born in Loudoun County, Virginia, February 23rd, 1893. So she was a special lady. Let me see what else we have in terms of questions and answers now here. Frank says, can you tell us briefly about your relationship with Mag Carney? Do you have anything else you can tell us about that?
Oh, do you have the rest of the day? But anyway, I met Mag Carney when I was investigating the faith. I was a teenager in Georgia, and I tell the story, but so if some of you have heard it, please forgive me. But I grew up in a small southern town and in Tennessee. And one day the white people moved into our community, and it was amazing because they were very strange. They, in this town, white people lived on one side of town, black people lived on the other side of town. White people had palatial, wonderful homes. Black people lived in very poor conditions, and their houses were just in bad shape. At any rate, these white Baha'is, Tom and Jean Shawandis, came into our community and said that they wanted to be our friends. And we were very suspicious because the only time white people came into our community was to either harm us or to try to get us to work for them at very low wages. So, long story short, Tom and Jean began to have events in their home. And at one point in time, this black woman shows up at their house, and we were sure that she was their maid. Well, of course not. It was Mag Carney. And if anything was the truth, it was the other way around. So that's how I met Mag Carney, who taught me about the faith along with the Shawandis, and was really a mentor. Several young people in my community, in addition to myself, became Baha'is, and Mag just had a guiding hand. She never left us alone. We heard from her. She would pick us up and take us to youth conferences and summer schools. It was really just a really precious relationship with her.
Paulette asks, could you say more about the concept of intersectionality?
Okay, sure. So intersectionality is a way, it really began as a legal term, as I said, that was coined by Kimberle Crenshaw, who at one point in her career was defending an African-American woman in court, and the judge was sentencing her too harshly for the crime she had committed. And Kimberle Crenshaw's argument was that you have to understand that this woman stands at the intersection of two issues, racism and sexism, and she's penalized for both of these things.
Yeah.
And so intersectionality, as she said, is a lens for us to look at women of color, but you can also expand it to anyone. But the whole point of that is to look at women of color and how their positionality, how they're positioned at these intersections, and how that brings about many times negative consequences. And you can't separate one from the other. I can't tomorrow say, oh, I'm just going to be Black today, I'm not going to be a woman, or I'm just going to be a woman today and not going to be Black. You can't separate these things. No. And so my experience in the world is mediated by that, as well as the world's reaction to me.
Yeah. Carmen says, thank you for a great presentation. How can we help the Baha'is recognize the importance of restorative history for building greater unity and helping to share the faith with more people of color?
Tell these stories. That's what we do. Learn about these ancestors, these forebearers who've gone before us. Learn their stories and tell them. You know, one of the things in the African American community that we treasure is storytelling. And so that's a great way to reach people of all ages, children, youth, adults. Become familiar with their stories and tell them. And I would also say collect them. You know, if you have African American elders in your communities, take their stories. Yeah. You have a phone. It has a recorder on it. Turn it on and ask them to share with you their life stories. Because, you know, one of the things that I found in this doing research on African American women Baha'is is that there are so many wonderful stories out there that we do not know, and we may not discover if we don't take the time to ask and to talk with others.
Yeah, this is very true. I think with great sadness how little we know about Pocahontas Pope, for example. Now we've got her grave. Yes. We found her grave when they've been able to restore it, which is fantastic. But reconstructing more about her life, how did she end up in Washington, D.C. from Virginia? You know, what was her life like growing up? Presumably she was either the seamstress or the washerwoman for the Hannon sisters. I don't know which, because I think that's how they made the contact with her and Carrie York. But those details we don't know as much about as we'd like to know. Olive Jackson, probably the first African-American woman in the Baha'i community. I mean, she's a name on a list on the New York City list for 1899. That, I think that plus the United States Census for 1900 is like all we know about her right now.
Yes.
And she remained in the Baha'i community for a while. It seems to me her name pops up on later lists as well. But you know, it'd be so nice if we had much more information about her. And indeed, her struggles. What were her struggles like?
Yes, what were her struggles and what were her victories? And I'm happy to say that two young women, I won't share their specifics right now, but are creating a video on Olive Jackson as a result of a project they're doing for Book 8. So this may be add to our further knowledge of Olive Jackson.
Yeah, fantastic. You never know what is lurking out there in the written records that are being digitized and put up on the internet. We may very well find newspaper articles about something that happened in her life.
Yes.
We never know. Or perhaps a newspaper article about a son or a daughter or a husband or someone who, maybe a son who fought in World War I, you know, we don't know. And then the next thing you know, we'll discover something more about her. And every day, more and more material is digitized and put up on the web. So we need Baha'is to be researching these topics and collecting the basics of the framework of the story if we can't fill in the details. And there
And
is.
you don't have to be a researcher, right? All you have to do is pay attention. And as you come across these things, share with others. Sometimes we find them in footnotes and book chapters and letters. And I'll never forget last year, Clyde Herron found some information on Halle Vera Queen in a book about someone else. And so you just never know, as you say, Rob, where that information will be found.
Yep, exactly. I'm still hopeful that someday we'll find a picture of Thornton Chase in his United States colored troops, and a picture of the USCT unit with him as an officer in it, because these units, a lot of them had photographs.
Yes.
And more of these photos are popping up. In fact, I even found one of, he's, I think, Company C. I can't remember. There was 2 USCTs that he was officer for. And I found a picture of Company D, but not Company C. You see, so I was very close. And you just never know. These kinds of things are there, and they'll pop up. There may be memories of people having this white officer. Hopefully, good memories.
Well, yes, we can
never know.
We can, yes, but that's the other thing too. Photography has been a way for African Americans to document their lives historically. And so that's another rich source of information. Even though we may not know the names of the folks in the photographs, just saving them and preserving them is a step toward knowing more.
Yep. I'm looking to see what else we have here. So that was a very good, that Carmen's question was very good, and that's very helpful. The story I was telling you about Dorothy Champ, who was a truly remarkable, inspiring lady for many of us young Baha'is. We knew her in her late 70s in her retirement, and she would have tea with us and tell us stories about being a Baha'i in New York in the 1920s and going to communist meetings and being in Harlem and all sorts of interesting things. And it was just thrilling to hear these stories and to be really inspired by this remarkable lady who had lived a difficult life. Her husband had left her, and then she gave up her career to go pioneering to serve the faith. So
she was resilient. And, that's the other thing that I think, another takeaway, at least for me, when I look at these wonderful stories of those who have gone before us, the resilience that they show in their lives and that they lived and that they practiced. It's just, and again, that's why I always ask, what's the takeaway? What can we learn from this? Can
you tell us anything more about Irma Hayden? Did you meet Irma Hayden?
Yes, of course. I met Irma Hayden. As I was saying, I met Irma when I was a undergraduate at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and Irma would come to pick us up. Let's see, Irma would come and pick us up and take us to the Sunday devotionals. And so I would invite my roommate and a couple of my friends to go to devotionals. And Irma was kind enough to come and pick us up and drive us to the center because we lived too far away to walk or and I think the buses were not running regularly. But anyway, so one of the things that we would all sit in the back, and there was like 3 of us in the back and occasionally one person in the front. But the thing that we noticed is that Irma was so enthusiastic and talking about the faith a mile a minute, but she was looking back at us while she was driving forward. So, we were interested in hearing what she said, but we were also a little tense. But we never had any accidents. She got us there safely. And like Meg, she nurtured us in the faith. And then when I was in grad school at the University of Michigan working on my doctorate, Irma was living in Ann Arbor at the time, and I got reacquainted with her, and as I said before, got to spend time with her and to collect her oral history.
Since you were up in that area, did you ever meet Eulalia Bobo? I've heard legendary stories about Eulalia.
I did.
Tell us about Eulalia.
Eulalia, I met her, but I think by the time I met her, she had moved south. But anyway, she was noted for her firesides that lasted till midnight and beyond, and was just so very profoundly interesting in so many ways. For example, she talked about having visions and dreams, and that in fact is what led her to the faith. And one of the things that she said was that that kind of sticks out in my mind is that at one point in time, as she's telling her story when I'm interviewing her, she says, I wanted to help people and I felt helpless. My brother, Joe Louis, was the heavyweight champion of the world and he couldn't help people. So how could I help people in my lowly stage of development? And then I discovered the Baha'i faith, and, her narratives goes on. And so, yes, very interesting person. And I see a question in the chat from Frank. Hi, Frank Qualls, about Wilma Brady. And I do have a family history of the Ellis family. And one of the things that is in Lights of the Spirit. And one of the things that we know is that Valerie Wilson, the Baha'i pioneer to Liberia that I was talking to you about, was learned about the faith in the Ellis family living room, and Sadie Ellis became her mentor.
There's a connection there as well. And I was quite happy to see Bill Foster in that picture of the Liberian friends as well. He was a remarkable man, just so on fire with the love of the faith and of Shoghi Effendi, of course. His devotion to Shoghi Effendi was really quite amazing. And he had this story about Liberia that he told a bunch of us at Greenacre once, that the young Liberian Baha'i said, "What do we say about the faith? We don't know how to answer people's questions, So he gave them this passage from Shoghi Effendi, that Shoghi Effendi had written this letter, I guess, to the some UN organization about Palestine, describing what the faith taught, and he had them memorize it, and he called it the gun. Someone asked the question, pull out the gun. And so they would memorize this passage from Shoghi Effendi about the nature of the faith, and use that, a bit of like Anna's conversation 40 years earlier kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and the other thing too that kind of sticks out in my mind is all of the different teaching strategies that we see in these early narratives. And when I was sharing with you the story of Lucille Webster, I thought that was a beautiful way to demonstrate reverse psychology. No, you can't read that. No, until, Lucille couldn't stand it anymore. And Mrs. Mabel Perry herself is a very interesting Baha'i woman. She taught herself Braille and was the first Baha'i to translate some of the writings into Braille.
Even though she wasn't blind.
Right.
Wow. That's an amazing story right there.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. You have been collecting oral history from the sound of things for quite a while, and you have quite an archive of it.
I do. And I want to find a safe place for it. I did give some of the tapes to the archives in 2016. I don't know what happened to them. It was cassette tape, if you can, and but I have transcripts, and so it's my wish that this information does not go away, that it is preserved. That's my wish.
That's absolutely true. I'm sure they had a major digitization project going on at about that time. So there's a good chance that those tapes have been converted into a file, an MP3 file, or whatever the audio file would be. I have probably sitting right here on my desk, in fact, a cassette tape of my interview with Thornton Chase Jr.'s wife, and they digitized that. So yeah, they've been doing a lot of work. And one thing I want to encourage people to, as you said, go interview people. If not with your phone and you can't get to their house because of the coronavirus, send them a Zoom link like this and Zoom with them and record it. And of course, nowadays there's transcription software that'll convert it.
Right. If you do an interview on Zoom, Zoom itself has an app that will transcribe the interview. So, I mean, now in this age of technology, there's so many ways we can do this.
Yep, exactly. Well, I don't see any other questions, and this has been truly a delightful afternoon, and I'm so glad that you've been able to make this presentation and join us today to talk about the stories of these remarkable African American women Baha'is and their predecessors who were not Baha'is as well, and their resilience, their sacrifices, their challenges, their struggles, and their victories as well. And these are victories really for all of us, and victories all of us can learn from.
Yes.
So thank you very much. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And I want to thank our audience and invite them again to come in May to attend our symposium on early American Baha'i history in North Carolina, Missouri, and Kansas. So thank you, everyone, and see you again at that time, I hope, next month. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rob.